Hey there, friends. It's Angela here for EllenHudson.com. Thank you so much for stopping by to check out today's video. A new release has just landed in the Ellen Hudson shop a couple of weeks ago, and in case you haven't seen it yet, it is a celebration-themed one and truly one of my favorites so far. Today we're going to take a closer look at a trio of items that was part of this release, the Hey You stamp set, hot foil stamp, and die. And I'm going to show you a couple of alignment tricks that I discovered while working with these that I think you might find helpful. For our color palette today, I was in the mood for some corals and teals, so we've got some Catherine Pooler inks in Bay Breeze and Hot Tub, Coral Cabana and Do-Si-Do, plus some Apricot and Bellini. For my first project, I'm going to get started by foiling the Hey You hot foil stamp on plain white cardstock. I'm going to do this in Shiny Gold Spellbinders Glimmer Foil, and in order to avoid any going to waste, I also use the Essentials by Ellen press plate to reverse foil my leftovers. And I'm going to use this piece when we make our second card, so I'll set it aside for now. I decided to pull out my Brutus Monroe stick and stamp mat for the stamping I'm about to do, because I really didn't want my cardstock to move out of place in my MISTI, but if you have great confidence in your bar magnets, you could just use those instead. So I've got the Hey You stamp on the MISTI door, and you didn't see me do it, but I simply just positioned it over my foiled sentiment to get the placement right. My plan was to stamp each letter in a different color in my color palette. So I've got a roll of Post-it tape nearby, and I'm going to use that to cover off the sections of the stamp as I ink up the letters. There's 9 letters, and I've got 6 colors. So I'm starting with Do-Si-Do, and I'm going to ink both of the H's, then remove the Post-it tape quickly, then stamp. As you can imagine, any shifting cardstock here would be a disaster if I need to repeat stamp any of my letters, and I did. So the sticky mat was definitely a good idea. I've repeated the same process, masking off letters while I moved on to Coral Cabana, removing that Post-it tape, and stamping. If you're thinking, wow, this is going to take a while, you're right, it does require a little bit of patience, but I think the end result is totally worth it. The spacing of the letters on this stamp is also really nice. They're not too close together, and that makes it really easy to cover them up when you're going to stamp each different color so that you don't get ink on any of the sections you don't want to stamp. Once I finished working through all of the colors, I did my best to very carefully peel away the stick and stamp mat, peeling it back instead of the cardstock so that I wouldn't warp my project too much. And yes, I did flick it right off and drop it, but it's okay because here she is looking absolutely lovely, don't you think? I love that. Moving on, now we're getting into our chat about alignment. As you can see here, I'm positioning the Hey You die over my stamp panel, but I'm really having to guess because there aren't any open spaces in the die, and I'm really just hoping that I have the cutting lines matched up with the edges of the stamped letters. Luckily, it worked. I don't know how. And as you can see, I did a pretty decent job, but if things had been off, it would have been a shame because that stamping took a while. So as we get into our later projects, I'll show you how I figured out how to never have to be in this position again. But first, we need to get this first card made. So let's hold that thought for now. I'm going to use the Spellbinders Arches embossing folder here to create a really subtly textured white background. And that bright white is really going to let my stamped and foiled letters pop. I trimmed a white panel down to 3.5 by 4 3/4, then put that inside the embossing folder and ran it through my die cutting machine with a rubber embossing pad to make this really fun repeating arch impression. But you can use any embossing folder that you have. Now I'm ready to adhere my letters, and to make them a bit more sturdy, I cut out a bunch of extras from white cardstock, and I'm stacking 2 white ones behind every colored one. Again, yes, this does take a little while, but I think the extra dimension is totally worth it, and it helps the card to hold up a little bit better in the mail. Also, I don't know about you, but I find it strangely relaxing. You'll never hear me complain about stacking die cuts Fussy cutting, on the other hand, is another story, but we don't have to do any of that today, which is great. Okay, now I'm adhering my dry embossed panel to a nice white A2 card base with a bunch of foam tape. And normally I'd put the letters on first, but I guess I just felt like mixing it up and living on the edge on this particular day. Thankfully, nothing went sideways here. I'm all set to adhere my letters. Here's where my first alignment trick comes in. I've taken the panel that I die cut the Hey You letters from. Yes, you do not want to throw that guy away. And I've trimmed that down to the same 3.5 by 4 3/4 as my card panel. This way I can position it right over top. I'll hold it in place on my glass mat with a couple of magnets, and then I'll just stick my letters into the gaps. And since I use liquid glue here, I'm going to set that aside and just give it a chance to dry before I pull that alignment guide off. So we'll come back to this one at the end. And moving on to the second project, and since my alignment guide was already in use, I quickly made another one with the Hey You die again, just out of white cardstock. If you remember back to our first card, I had to guess where I was placing that die over top, and I didn't want to have to do that again here with my reverse foiled letters, because then I would have to create a new panel if I messed up. So I realized that I could put the foiled panel down on my die cutting mat, the magnet, then put the alignment guide right on top so that those thin letters were centered right in the gaps, and then place the die cutting side down on top. And since my alignment guide is made from 110-pound cardstock, I can just feel for the gaps in the guide, and the die just falls right into those spaces. You'll see that after I run it through my die cutting machine, I can remove the die, remove the guide, and voila, the cuts are exactly where I want them. Now the second card needs a background, so I'm using the new 4-piece sprinkles stencil set, and I'm going to use all 4 stencils. You'll notice that my stencil is all of a sudden covered in ink, and that's because I had a little mishap with my first attempt, so this is attempt 2. There's nothing difficult about this stencil, I promise. My first mistake was purely laziness on my part, and it slipped out of place. So I used Catherine Pooler Bay Breeze first, then went a little lighter on the second stencil with some Hot Tub. Then for the 2 stencils of round sprinkles, I used Coral Cabana. So there's my background, which I'm going to set aside for the moment while I die cut the Hey You HBD letters from cardstock this time. If the multicolor stamping we did earlier was a little more than you want to deal with, cardstock is a great and slightly faster option. Just pick the colors you like, and there you go. I'm going to trim my down my background panel again to 3.5 by 4 3/4 because your girl likes a nice thick border on her cards. And once I've done that, I'm going to pop all of my reverse foiled letters out, then use that negative as my alignment guide this time. Again, I've cut it down to the same size as my background panel, and I'm using my magnets to hold it in place while I glue the cardstock letters in the gaps. Also, I don't do it here for the sake of time, but you can certainly stack up those cardstock letters to give them more of a chipboard weight if you want to. That's totally up to you. Once all of those are set in their spots, I'm pulling the gold piece off really carefully, and I'm going to now use my gold letters and layer them on top of the colored cardstock, very slightly offset so that the color can still be seen behind them. Finally, I'll finish it off by putting some foam tape all over the back and mounting it onto my A2 card base, and voila, a lovely, very shiny second card. Okay, finally card number 3, and I think this just might be my favorite, friends. I'm starting here with making a background, and I'm borrowing the little dot stamps from the Cake Day stamp set, getting those all set up on an acrylic block just in a little cluster. I've already prepared my white background panel using the Essentials by Ellen confetti hot foil stamp. And I'm going to use my scattered dot stamps to layer up little clusters in all of my pink and orange colored inks. My inspiration here was those really gorgeous looking cakes. You know, the ones where there's a bunch of sprinkles around the edge near the bottom. You find them all over Pinterest. That's what I was going for. And I've never tried to make one of those cakes, but something's telling me that stamping sprinkles on paper is a lot easier than trying to get real sprinkles to stick on a vertical cake surface. I'm continuing to fill up the space here, just stamping the dots quite randomly and trying to fill up most of the white areas. Every so often you'll see me go in with a tissue, and that's just blotting slightly over the foiled areas because I don't want any ink that's come in contact with those areas to smudge. Once that panel was all confettied up, I trimmed it down, you guessed it, to 3.5 by 4 3/4 of an inch. Then set to work on all of my letters. This time I went for simple, just white ones with gold foil. And you can see that I'm using the same trick of placing the die into the grooves of my alignment guide to make sure the letters stay centered when I'm running them through my die cutting machine. Then I'm going to use the guide again for my letter alignment. And this time I decided that I'd had enough of stacking letters, so I pulled out my super skinny foam strips, just for fun, and covered the back of all of the letters in those. And then from there, I popped the letters into all of their little holes in the alignment guide, peeled back the alignment guide, and then put foam tape all over the back of that panel and popped it up on another A2 card base. So there we go. All 3 of our projects are confetti spots, the card with the sprinkle stencil, and our multicolored letter stamping on the textured background. I really hope you found the tips in this video helpful and that you'll give them a try with some of the products in your own stash. For full details, including the products I've used today and a few extra tips, head over to the Ellen Hudson blog, which I've linked in the description. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe bell. That way you'll never miss a new video. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you back here soon. Bye!